Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, part of this community relations team, and we are glad you've joined us for this program. If you found your way to this program via our calendar, you also know that we have a ton of material and content up on our YouTube page. We have something for everybody, including cooking programs, story times, poetry readings. So we hope you will take advantage of all the great content the Deschutes Public Library is making possible. Today's presentation, No Wild, Wildflowers of Oregon, is part of our series, No Wild, where we're taking a look at all things wild. Our presenter, Damian Fagan, is a former National Park Service ranger and field biologist who has a passion for plants. With a BS in botany from the University of Washington, he has photographed and studied wildflowers throughout the West. He has written 2 wildflower field guides, Wildflowers of Oregon and Canyon Country Wildflowers. A freelance writer and occasional outdoor recreation instructor for COCC's continuing education, he is most at home surrounded by the flora and fauna of the great outdoors. Please welcome Damian Fagan.
Thanks for having me, Liz. I appreciate it. I'm just going to start this window. And thanks everybody for tuning in to Wildflowers of Oregon. I thought we'd spend a little bit of time taking kind of a field trip throughout Oregon, a great state to look at the diversity of flowering plants across the state, from the coast to the Cascades, out to the high desert. It kind of doesn't matter where you go, there's always places to look at wildflowers or flowering shrubs. And even if it's non-flowering time, then you can go for the other wild things that are out there, the birds, the mammals, those sorts of things. So I'm going to also focus a little bit on one of the field guides that I wrote, but I also want to highlight, because a lot of times these field guides are a compilation of everyone else's work, from early botanists to previous authors to current research. So really, it's a work in progress, but it's also a compilation of a lot of people and their input into understanding and getting to know flowering plants throughout the state and throughout the West. So you'll see some various field guides that I'm going to feature and kind of tie them into some of these areas that I'm going to be talking about. So as you can see here on the front screen, lots of great diversity of flowers throughout the state. Here again, a little picture of Oregon, lots of recreation, a lot of places to go wild in. If you're looking to know the wild, obviously the west side of the Cascades, kind of very heavy forests, lots of verdant growth. You have the Cascades, you get up into the forests and alpine areas, and then out into eastern Oregon, into that high desert country, and very sparsely populated, but a wonderful place to go visit. So a few little things about plants. Obviously, they're a huge component to our world and to our planet. Food, medicinal resources, habitat for wildlife, a tremendous contribution to our planet. So always kind of want to give thanks to those plants for being there. And then also thanks to what I like to call the first botanists, Native American tribes that inhabited North America prior to European settlement. Various tribes throughout Oregon, Central Oregon, you can see some of these tribes that were in this region, others also moving through. But if you think about the trial and error that went through these Native Americans determining which plants were edible, which plants had medicinal properties that could treat all sorts of ailments, it's an amazing process. Obviously, they probably watched some of the animals, what they were foraging on, but still, when you think about harvesting some plants to treat specific illnesses, that's a pretty amazing trial and error process. So a lot of credit, a lot of thanks go to these early botanists, the Native Americans. Also, too, when a lot of Western settlement was taking place, exploration in the 1700s, 1800s, sort of those first scientific surveys that were taking place here, the Native Americans shared a lot of their information with the Europeans that were coming into this area. And so they didn't hoard that information, they shared it, helped keep a lot of people alive. So a lot of credit goes to these early botanists. Here's a picture that I love, where there's a plant, and you'll see it in the slideshow, common camas, where the Native Americans harvested the bulbs of the camas plants, and then they would bake them in these earthen pits for a couple of days, and then eat them as food. But you can see just that supply that had to be harvested to feed a tribe, a group, whatever number of people were there. Also, a lot of these early botanists harvested plants to make items from. Here with the Oregon flag and beargrass, the leaves are very strong, but once they're split into individual fibers, the Native Americans could either weave these fibers into larger pieces of rope or twine, and then those would get woven again and make all sorts of baskets, hats, these sorts of things. So a lot of artifacts also come from just the plant materials. When you talk about plant taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish person, came up with the sort of binomial nomenclature. So coming up with the genus species. He organized what was kind of a chaotic system into a hierarchy of how plants relate to each other. And this process is still in use today. Today, with a lot of genetic testing, there's some variations. Some plants have changed family names that many people might think of, like the beargrass being in the lily family. It's no longer in that family, it's in a different family. So genetic relationships have changed some of that taxonomy. One of the things I always like to throw in is Linnaean, this Linnaean clock. Linnaeus had this idea that you could plant flowers that would bloom during associated hours of the day. And I always thought, this would be kind of a cool project to see if you could grow these different plants and everything would be opening and closing different parts of the day. Getting a little bit farther along into 18th century, 19th century, getting these European explorers starting to come to the New World. Archibald Menzies was on the George Vancouver expeditions to the Northwest, collected a ton of different plant specimens. Maybe people are familiar with Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menzesii, and that was named in honor of Menzies. Obviously here in Oregon, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, their expedition that came through looking for passage to the Northern Territories, or the Northwest Passage, excuse me. They also collected plants, animals along the way. A lot of these, or some of these were destroyed at one point when they flipped a boat in the river, but a lot of them survived, and these were brought back to Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, and turned over to a fellow we'll see a little farther into the presentation, Frederick Persh, who started organizing and naming plants. And a lot of them were named after Lewis and Clark. You'll see that those names pretty often in some of these plant names. They wrote down over 260 plants. Maybe half of them were new to science. So the Native Americans knew about these plants, obviously, but the new age of discovery, science, the naming of plants, the whole taxonomy, this was kind of a new process. So, the Lewis and Clark journals are always fun to look through if you never have, just for the flowery language that they used. It's a fun read. This fellow, David Douglas, here again, back to the Douglas fir, kind of a major tree here in the Northwest. He was a Scottish botanist who came out into this area, collected plants kind of all over Oregon, as well as some other places. You can see here where he did some collecting. During that time period too, London societies were looking for plants that would not only be new to science, but also would grow in their gardens, grow in Europe. So a lot of these plants that were sent back had cuttings and seeds and roots that would form plants. So it was not just for science, but also for gardens, and then maybe also it would be a new plant that could be grown for food, something like that. Couple characters that I really like. Nathaniel Wyeth goes by the nickname of the Cambridge Iceman because he lived in Boston, had an ice business, but really got bitten by the bug to go west and explore the Oregon Territory. So he led a couple of expeditions, funded on his own, and I think 1832 and 1834. And some of those expeditions, some famous ornithologists, botanists would tag along with him. It was a safe way to get across the country, going in a caravan of explorers, Thomas Nuttall being one of these. A lot of plants folks might be associated with that Nuttall name. But Nathaniel Wyeth, he also collected a few plants. Some were named after him, like the white mule's ears that you see there, kind of that big white sunflower. Wyethia is the genus, or was the genus. It's been renamed. But, there's a fellow here in Bend who works for Visit Bend. His name is Nate Wyeth. Some of you might know him. And he is a descendant of Nathaniel Wyeth. And if you ever ask Nate about me interacting with him at a meeting, I was so excited. I wanted to meet him because I knew all about Nathaniel Wyeth. And I thought, oh, this has to be a relative of his. So we spent probably 15 minutes of the meeting just talking about history and Nathaniel Wyeth while everyone's waiting for the meeting to get started. Okay, so into some of the traveling through Oregon. You can see here this flora of the Pacific Northwest. This is a technical botanical key to plants in the Northwest. It's kind of the Bible, if you will, of taxonomy to identifying plants. Hardbound book, just went through its second printing fairly recently. But a very technical key to go through. You kind of have to keep your finger in the glossary to keep looking up all the terminology. Obviously, the state of Oregon, very diverse, as many of us know, as we've been traveling through it, from precipitation to the geology, the soils that are here, hydrology, obviously on the west side, a lot more water, a lot more rivers than we do over here on the east side. So some of this map is just broken up into these regions. Want to point out this one down in the bottom, the Klamath Mountains, as well as the Blue Mountains, because these are areas that have unique soils. These historically were islands off in the Pacific Ocean that eventually, because of plate tectonics, moved and kind of crashed into Western North America and became accreted is the word, kind of glued together to the continent, and eventually have become these mountain areas. So the soils are very unique in these areas. And then because of that, very unique assemblage of vegetation. So kind of go through a few areas across the state, some of my favorites to go look at wildflowers, but obviously there's a million places. Really anywhere you go, there's going to be some wildflowers. So starting out on the coast, Here's this book by Elizabeth Horn. It's a little bit older, Coastal Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest, but a great one for the coastal areas. This is a plant in the front called Angelica. It's a member of the carrot family. So maybe those flower heads look familiar if you're a gardener to carrots. And it was given that name Angelica because people thought that the plant would be able to ward off evil spirits. It had these angelic properties, hence the common name there. When you're living by the sea, it's a pretty tough environment. You've got salty spray, you've got kind of high winds, you've got these temperature fluctuations. So you really have to be a pretty hardy plant to grow there. And you'll find a lot of these plants have kind of thick leaves, almost fleshy leaves, waxy coatings. They're trying to retain moisture, not have it be lost to the atmosphere or dissipate. And then also a lot of them are low growing because of the winds that happen out there on the coast, and that Angelica being a little bit of the difference. These are all very low growing plants. The seaside daisy, seashore lupin, the yellow sand verbena, which is a very beautiful flower, kind of has these long root systems and rhizomes that are going across the surface of the ground, rooting at different places. And then also if the sands are blowing and they cover up those leaves and cover up the stems, the plant will just send off a shoot in a different direction and they kind of colonize these sand dunes. So it's kind of an interesting plant out in the dune country. And then sea kale down here at the bottom, you can see the leaves look very much like a kale plant that you might have in your garden. And the leaves are edible. But these plants also, their seeds probably got dispersed by seawater because it's growing right along the edge of the coastline. As the seeds get dispersed, the water is helping disperse those seeds. One of the first flowering shrubs along the coastline is this red flowering currant. Very beautiful red flowers, kind of low elevation plant. And as it blooms early in the spring, there's a timing with the rufous hummingbird that migrates, is feeding on the flowers, feeding on the nectar, eating insects that are on the plant, spiders, those sorts of things. So there's kind of this connection between the two. The hummingbird's probably also providing some pollination services to those flowers. Down by Florence, if you've never been to the Darlingtonia Botanical Wayside, it's a really cool place because it has these insectivorous plants. So literally plants that are eating insects and getting nutrients that way. They're common name cobra lily or cobra plant, but they have this sort of cobra-shaped leaves that are hollow. And insects, even small amphibians, get inside of there. It's sort of a translucent opaqueness to the leaves, so the animals get disoriented as to how to get out. They eventually become exhausted and fall down into the digestive fluids that are in the bottom of these tubes. They get digested, and that's the way the plant gets its nitrogen for its food source. So going up into the Columbia River Gorge, beautiful place, or great place to go in the early springtime. Good to go any time of year, but especially early spring, because there's fields of wildflowers that come out in March and April. And if you've gone through a kind of a long winter or gray winter on the west side of the state, really this is a splash of color. And one of the plants that blooms in profusion are these grass widows. Literally fields of them that grow there, kind of beautiful pinky violet color. And a great book for the Columbia River Gorge is this one by Russ Jolly, Wildflowers of the Columbia River Gorge. It it has identifying photographs and names, but the really nice aspect of this book is in the back where it has where to go, what time of year. So there's a lot of suggestions for places to go and look at specific wildflowers if that's what you're after. Up in the gorge, down here at the bottom, the balsam root and lupin, when they come into bloom kind of late April, spectacular. Hillsides are just covered with this kind of yellow and blue coloring, just amazing. The Dutchman's breeches, looks like a pair of pantaloons hanging on a clothesline. These are kind of a weird plant in Oregon because they mostly grow back east, but there's populations that grow out in this part of the country. So it's a unique plant for us to have out here. This one, manroot, is looks like cucumbers. The fruits resemble cucumbers. It's in the cucumber family. The roots were consumed. They're kind of bitter, so they were pounded up, really boiled, tried to make edible. The fruits are not edible, even though they look like a cucumber, like they would be. And then the little saxifrage is down below here. This plant's only 3 or 4 inches tall, but blooms in profusion in the gorge, kind of these wet, mossy areas. And there's a lot of different saxifrage species that grow in the gorge. A few others that are there, California poppies. You know, how can anyone not love a poppy? It's just such a beautiful colored flower. It looks so dainty. You have the Columbia Desert parsley, which is also an early season bloomer. So if you're looking for some color, you know, this is your plant. It's growing in kind of the talus slopes on the north side of the gorge, so on the Washington side, but comes into bloom early in the season. And then this one, Pacific hound's tongue, gets that name, hound's tongue, because of these long kind of tongue-shaped leaves. It's a member of the borage family, so we have a lot of borages that are garden plants. And this one's kind of got a cool dispersal mechanism where the seeds are these little nutlets with prickles on them. And the prickles snag to the fur of a passing animal, and that's how the plant gets dispersed. Okay, Iron Mountain. If you live in Central Oregon, you probably have heard of Iron Mountain. You've probably hiked up there. There's some great loop trails up in this area. It's a kind of a midway between the west side of the state and the east side. So kind of up in the old high Cascades. This is the summit right here. There used to be a fire lookout years ago, which burned. And now there's a platform that you can hike up to. It's a great vantage point. But there's a book, field guide, Wildflowers of the Western Cascades. And this book was really written for this area in particular. It has a lot of different habitats because of where it sits on the Cascade spine. So you have this huge diversity of plants that grow there. And it's a great book because it talks about the different habitats, what you'll see in these different habitats. And you can see the meadows down below, you know, spectacular, late June, early July. I always kind of think of July 4th as my target date to go up there. So plus or minus for the sort of peak of the meadow blooms. But it's not uncommon to see a graduate student from U of O or OSU or some other university out here collecting pollinators. So it's an area that gets a lot of work because there's such a diversity of plants. Here again, diversity of pollinators. As you go up to Iron Mountain, beargrass, you know, beautiful looking flowers. Here again, one of the ones where the Native Americans collected the leaves to use the fibers. And then some of the other plants, Trillium, which is an early season bloomer. The cool thing here is the seeds of Trillium have a little oily appendage on the tip of it that attracts ants. And so the ants will eat that appendage, but they'll also drag the seeds back to their nest. And so here, another way that the plant gets dispersed into the areas. You'll notice down here, mountain bee balm, a little bit later in the season, flowering mint plant, great for attracting pollinators. Fairy slipper orchids, well named because they just look so dainty, like it should be something that a fairy would wear. These plants, not very tall growing, but attract bumblebees as pollinators. The flowers don't produce any, they attract bees, I should say, not bumblebees. And they don't provide any floral rewards, no nectar, no pollen. So they're really relying on kind of those bees that really don't have a clue about where they're going. They just think, oh, that flower looks like it should provide these rewards. And it doesn't. So the bees get a little bit confused, but then they go try another one. And then that's how that pollen gets transferred. Here you can see Indian pipe, which looks like a kind of a clay pipe, and no chlorophyll in the stems at all, or the leaves. So this plant is relying on obtaining nutrients in the soil. They're mycorrhizal fungi that are down there that are associating with other plants, as well as the roots of these plants. And then that's how these plants called mycoheterotrophs are obtaining obtaining nutrients from the soil. You've got a couple others, and this is a pretty typical, like the ballhead gilia, where it's just fields and fields and fields of flowers up there. And then another different type of orchid, the spotted coral root that grows up there. And those little kind of purpley dots that are on the lower lip of the flower are like landing lights for bees to say, hey, here's your landing platform, and then you can enter into this flower. If you go down to kind of southern Oregon, down by the Kalamiopsis Wilderness, Cave Junction, that area, there's a place called $8 Mountain. And I've asked people that live or grew up in Grants Pass, why do they call it $8 Mountain? And some say it's because a person bought a pair of $8 boots, and by the time they walked all around the mountain, those boots had worn out. It's a pretty big mountain, $8 Mountain. Some other people say no, it was because they found a nugget of gold that was worth $8 way back when, and that's how it got the name. However it got its name doesn't really matter now because it's a botanical hotspot in Oregon. Here again, there's the Klamath Mountains that are down here, so it's a very unique soil type called serpentine soils. And because of that soil type, it has this unique assemblage of plants that grow down there. A really great guide throughout the whole Northwest, this Mark Turner book, Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest. Great photography, good descriptions. It's also pretty much online. So if you don't have a paper copy of it or hardback, you can get it online. But here is this road that goes up kind of past $8 Mountain, out of an area down by Cave Junction, and kind of wanders up towards the Kalamiopsis Wilderness. And then just all along the road here, there's just great places to look for wildflowers. There's this boardwalk that goes out and looks at a fen, F-E-N, which is kind of a unique habitat type, kind of a moist soil, vernal, seasonal, moist area. And here again, because of the soils, having a unique assemblage of these plants like California coneflower and the Mendocino gentian. This one, coffeeberry, is a shrub It's in the buckthorn family. Those of you who are in that know. Little tiny flowers, but you can see here kind of those coffee berry looking fruits, and that's where it gets the name. They weren't used as a coffee berry substitute, but there were some medicinal uses for the plants. The reds really show up down here in this $8 mountain area. California fuchsia, beautiful plant, red monkey flower. Those of us here in the Cascades or in Central Oregon going into the Cascades, probably familiar with yellow monkey flower or Lewis's monkey flower, which is a purple one. So this is kind of a unique species for this area. And then another one of these heterotrophs or microheterotrophs, snow plant, which almost looks like a little fire hydrant growing out of the soil. A lot of times this plant will bloom after the soil, or excuse me, after the snow starts melting away, and these plants will come up. Here again, no chlorophyll, so it's having to obtain nutrients through these associations with the mycorrhizal fungi. But a spectacular plant. You see it from a distance, it's unmistakable. Crater Lake, a lot of the Cascades have alpine areas which are great to get up into to look at wildflowers. The beauty with Crater Lake is you can drive up into that alpine or a short walk and get up into these areas. Here again, a couple plants, or excuse me, a couple books, Mountain Plants of the Pacific Northwest, and then there is a specific guide that's to Crater Lake wildflowers. A lot of these plants growing above timberline, very short season. If you've been down there in May and June, the road might not even be open yet because there's still so much snow. So a lot of these plants really race through their life cycles. They're low growing. They, like the elegant daisy, attract a host of different insect pollinators. And then this one, steer's head, which is related to bleeding hearts, for those of you who are gardeners. And the flower looks like a little head of a, skull of a cow. Very low growing. These flowers maybe a half-inch long, so hard to find. Really, when you're out there looking, you're looking for the leaves, first of all. And then if you see those kind of lobed leaves, you start looking for the flowers. They're very cryptic. A couple other kind of high elevation plants, these pussy paws, because of the flower heads resemble the underside of a cat's foot. So that's where the name pussy paw comes from. If you've ever been up in the Cascades hiking, lost that one. That alpine buckwheat has a aroma like dirty socks. So kind of another common name for that one is dirty socks. The Lewis's monkey flower, here again related to that other monkey flower that we looked at, the red one from over in $8 Mountain area, as well as yellow monkey flowers, which grow around. This one was named for Meriwether Lewis. He collected a specimen of this. Kind of a bushy plant, so grows maybe a couple feet high, a couple feet wide, but spectacular in the summertime. So Central Oregon, finally to our backyard. Lots of great places here in the high desert to go out and look for flowering plants, shrubs. Kind of had to throw in the big tree if you've been down to Lapine State Park, that monster ponderosa pine. And then a great book here by Leanne, The Nature of Bend. So kind of looks at not only plants, but wildlife as well in the area, insects, pollinators, those sorts of things. So a lot of great diversity. This one here, spreading dogbane, is a member of the milkweed family. It's related pretty closely to milkweed. And the flower structure has a little slits in the top of it. So if you're a small pollinator, you land there and you can't pull your leg out, you get stuck on the flowers. So it's a way for the plant to kind of encourage strong enough pollinators that can land, get pollen, and then fly off. And then pine drops, this plant here, another one of these plants that has mycorrhizal fungi associated with it, but a very beautiful looking flower here to a plant that doesn't have any chlorophyll. Some of the other plants, and few of these are shrubs. So snowbrush, which is a fire-resistant plant. You'll see it come in after a wildflower here, or wildfire here in Central Oregon. Very, very fragrant. You might smell this plant before you see it. And because of that fragrance, it attracts a lot of bees and wasps as pollinators. Down here, bitterbrush, which is a member of the rose family. Kind of a easily overlooked shrub during most of the year, but when it comes into bloom, these yellowish flowers really coat the plant. And it's a very important browse plant for mule deer, especially in the wintertime. So it's a good plant to encourage in your yard, or it also comes back after fires out in the woods. And then manzanita. This one, the name manzanita comes from little green apples. So when the flowers turn into fruits, first there'll be these little greenish looking apple looking fruits. But beautiful little kind of urn-shaped pink flowers. And then the gilia, scarlet gilia, blooms later in the season. And with these long kind of tubular flowers, you have to think hummingbirds are pollinating these, or butterflies, one of those two. Something that can have a long tongue that can reach down those tubes to grab the nectar rewards in the flowers. And as we go out a little bit farther east into the high desert, kind of another different assemblage of plants. The yellow bells here on the upper left, early season little lily member. Probably one of my favorites is the sand lily, which comes into bloom early in the season, very low growing, almost looks like from a distance like somebody spread some Kleenex on the ground. Very, very white, brilliant white, low growing lily, beautiful. And then during certain years where there's enough moisture, these plants will bloom in profusion. So there'll be a lot of them. Other dry years, maybe not as many. The wallflower down here, member of the mustard family. So it might look like some plants people grow in their gardens. Western wallflower has a huge elevational range that it is distributed over, from low elevation to up to maybe 10,000 feet. And then the bitterroot here, a beautiful low growing plant. The leaves come out first, and then they sort of wither away, and then out comes the flower. This is what gave the Bitterroot Valley over in Idaho, Montana area its name, because of these plants growing up there. And then one of the, I put this one in even though we saw the Indian pipe earlier. These are Facebook pages. So if you're looking to see what is being seen in the area in terms of wildflowers, these are great resources. Central Oregon Wildflowers, and then the Oregon Wildflowers Facebook pages. So good way to keep up on what's being seen where, and to also post what you're seeing out there in the areas. Okay, so John Day fossil beds, we're still kind of in this Eastern Oregon, moving a little bit drier terrain. Great, a little bit older book. I think it was from about the 80s, maybe early 90s. This Ronald Taylor, Sagebrush Country, focusing on plants that are growing out in the sagebrush. This is sagebrush buttercup, which unmistakable when you're out there walking around in early spring and you see this yellow color off of the ground growing amongst the sagebrush. Some of the other plants, here again, you get a lot of this lupin and balsam root growing out there. These Mariposa lilies, gorgeous, that kind of purpley color, but also a little bit of variation in there. Very delicate looking flowers. This one, old man's whiskers. Some people call it prairie smoke because of the seeds have these long feathery hairs attached to them, and when you put them, when they're all together in a little cluster, it looks like a little puff of smoke. And then here again, over in the John Day area, when the moisture is right from winter storms, early spring storms, you can get this spectacular blooms of wildflowers that are growing. This one's the John Day pincushion. It's a Canactus species, and it gets the name pincushion because of when the seed heads form, they look like pins being stuck into a old-time pincushion. So a few others. One kind of alluded to the person, Frederick Persch, who took the Lewis and Clark expedition plants that were collected and started to categorize them into different plant families, genus, species. So he was naming a lot of these plants and organizing that. This one is named after him. Some people call it Persch's milk vetch as well. It's a member of the Astragalus genus, Astragalus perschii. And it has these little cottony kind of covered seed heads in the springtime, but it's an early season bloomer, as well as the phlox, the spreading phlox, early season carpeting the grounds. And then here we have the nine leaf biscuit root. Biscuit roots were harvested by Native Americans, ground up or boiled as a food source, hence kind of that name, biscuit root. And this is also another early season flower, and sometimes growing in profusion, especially in these grassland areas. So the Steens, this huge block fault escarpment kind of down in southeast Oregon, here again goes up to, I think, 9,000 or 10,000 feet. And so winter is a long season up there. So when it gets to be summer season, a lot of these plants really have to race through their life cycle to get through it in order to flower, set seed, and then get covered over by the next winter. So great place to go hiking, exploring if you've never been up there. This one, Flora of the Steens Mountain, is kind of a technical key, but also has some good descriptions of the plants that are up there. And because of the this geologic escarpment up to here, you have here again some unique plants. So you can actually have a whole floral guide that's just to this one region. Few of the plants that grow up in this area, you know, just some beautiful coloring, beautiful texturing. The Steens Mountain thistle, a lot of people associate thistles with weedy plants, but this is actually a native, and it is named after its location up there in the Steens Mountain. Very tall, growing plant, great for attracting butterflies as pollinators. And then you have in these kind of moist meadows up there, a lot of the shooting stars, this dark-throated shooting stars. And these plants, they're interesting because I don't know if you can see very well, but the kind of the shooting star, so here are the petals, you have the stamens down here that produce the pollen, and bumblebees will come up and they will vibrate their thoracic muscles, and in such a way that it creates the pollen to get released from the stamens and dust the bee. Bee flies off, comes in contact with another flower, and pollination gets completed that way. Big Summit Prairie up in the Ochocos, great place to go, as soon as the snow melts, really, and you can get up into there. Though there's a number of apps online for helping to identify wildflowers and plants, there's a project called the Oregon Floral Project, which is a great online tool. You can download the app. It helps you go through identifying plants. If you know a genus or a family name, it helps reduce the number of possibilities. You can search by color. It's a great resource that's online, or excuse me, that you can get onto an iPhone or an Android phone. And then up in the Big Summit Prairie, you get these swaths of color. Here again, white mule's ears, named after our buddy Nate Wyeth, growing just fields and fields and fields of these flowers. And then maybe off in the distance back here, there's fields of the yellow balsam root, related sunflower plant to this one. And then maybe on another section of the Big Summit Prairie, there's fields of camas. These beautiful looking kind of purpley violet colors. These are the ones where the Native Americans harvested the bulbs as a food source. And they would tend these camas fields to get rid of the kind of competing death camas bulbs. So if you're going through to harvest bulbs, you want to make sure that there's no death camas in the mix, because these ones are toxic, but they also grow in the same areas. Also up in Big Summit Prairie, you have a unique plant here, this balloon pod milkvetch. Low growing, very small. These flowers are maybe a 1/4 inch long, but you can see this inflated seed pod with kind of that mottling color. So it's a very pretty seed pod. The ragged robins, this is one plant that people can obtain seeds from through a commercial nursery, spread in your garden. Very colorful, beautiful looking flower. And then one of my favorites is the Brown's peony. It's the native peony that grows in this area. These flowers are a couple inches across, heavy, so that they tend to weigh down the branches. And because they're so low growing, you have ants that are coming in to be one of the pollinators of these flowers. You get up into the moist meadows that are up there in the Ochocos, and you have monk's hood, which looks like the hood of a like 16th century friar. Very toxic plant, but also you find it in some modern day herbals. So it's always a kind of a weird one with some of these plants where they have both of those properties. And then corn lilies, they have a lily-like flower, but a growth like a corn stalk. Sometimes there are just patches of these up in the Ochocos. So you feel like you're walking through a corn maze in the middle of summertime. So one of the things associated with a lot of these flowers are obviously pollinators. The flowers are either designed in shape, color, structure to attract different types of pollinators. Some are very specific, some are very generic, so they'll attract a wide variety of pollinators. Local author Buddy Mays here in Bend wrote this book, Butterflies in Bend in Central Oregon. Great one if you're out there and wanting to learn more about the pollinators, the critters that are doing the work of helping pollinate these flowers. Sometimes it's hard to not get caught up in the identification of the flowers. Everyone's always wanting to know the name of them. sometimes if you can't figure it out, maybe you can figure it out to a certain level, like the family level. It's in the aster family or the sunflower family. Maybe you can figure out farther down, it's in the genus Wyethia, or some other genus. But if not, it's still, these flowers are beautiful. They've got these interesting structures. They've got these interesting associations with insects, pollinators, maybe hummingbirds that are pollinating them. So sometimes it's fun just to remember to enjoy those flowers for their structure, their function, their color, all those sorts of things. And don't worry so much about the name. And you get some of these white-lined stink moths with their long proboscis that can reach into these delphinium. Here's the floral tube up here. So there's nectar down the bottom. So really, you need to have a long-tongued creature to come pollinate. Some little bee or fly or wasp, their tongue isn't anywhere near long enough to be able to reach that. So these flowers are kind of being a little more specific into which types of pollinators come to them. The other thing with wildflowers is you get up in these meadows, it's spectacular. You're just looking at color and butterflies, and it's just amazing. And then, you kind of forget to look around because you're so focused up close looking at these flowers. So I always put in this little bear cub going through a meadow, which happened to me in Mount Rainier National Park. Literally turned around, here's this bear cub zipping through the meadow. Just remember to stand up, turn around, look around every now and then. So thanks very much for joining me. I know it's been a whirlwind tour, kind of across Oregon, looking at some of these plants and flowers. Here's the wildflower book that I've done through Falcon Press. So you can never have too many field guides. That's always my rule of thumb. I have shelves of them. Some of these, because the taxonomy changes, there's DNA that's being used to, and genetic material that's being used to associate plants. So sometimes the names get changed, the families get changed, things go a little bit out of date, but still it's great to have all those different resources. Everybody's got a little bit of different information to provide about these plants. So I just want to say thanks very much to the library for having me. Hope you've enjoyed this. Check out, there's a ton of resources in the library for this, as well as online. So, get out there, enjoy the wildflowers, enjoy the views, and hope you have a great year.
Thanks, Damian. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen. I've just got a couple of questions for you that came up while I was watching your presentation. Such gorgeous photographs. Thank you for sharing, and really interesting stories, the structure and how they get pollinated, and the little stories about how, some of them are so quirky and how they go about that. Just one question. I'm wondering, do you predict like a wildflower, how robust a wildflower season is going to be based on the winter? Or are we always just waiting to figure that out when blossoming happens?
Yeah, a lot of times if you have, like, especially down here in the high desert where it's a drier environment to start with. So if we have a wet winter, lots of moisture, lots of rain, so it's soaking into the soil. Some of these plants, their seeds have little chemical inhibitors, so they won't germinate unless there's been enough moisture that's gone through the soil. So when we have those really wet winters and then maybe a wet early spring as well, you start thinking, oh, it could be a spectacular year because things will bloom in mass, not just one plant being more robust, but all of a sudden you'll be plants blooming that you never saw out there before. So that time period is kind of a critical one. Some folks also think that, getting that moisture in the late fall, so that here again, those seeds can germinate and then they'll start growing as the conditions get right. So the couple of apps that I showed on the Central Oregon wildflowers and Oregon wildflowers are great to go through, because you can go through the archives and see, okay, July 20th last year, who was seeing what types of flowers and where. So, that'll give you some general ideas too, if you're looking for bloom times. The book by Russ Jolly, Wildflowers of the Columbia River Gorge, has a great timetable in the back, and really going to a specific place, March 15th, and these are the flowers you'll probably find. So that's also a great resource.
Yeah, thanks. I've a question is about one of the flowers. I love peonies also, but I've never heard of the Brown's peony, and I'm wondering, do they smell as good as the peonies that grow domestically?
That's a good question. I don't think they're as sweet smelling as some of the cultivated ones, because they're been, horticulturally modified to have that really sweet aroma.
Yeah. Okay. And so my save this question for the last. Never ever had heard or seen a picture of the cobra plant. That is some crazy stuff right there.
It is. And you have these different insectivorous plants like a Venus flytrap, but that's more of a collapsing as a insect lands on the hairs in the leaves, and it triggers that. But the other one, where they get inside there and then get all discombobulated, can't get out, and just run out of energy, and then get dissolved. So the diversity that's out there is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And I know this program is going to debut in March, and just when people are starting to get anxious and wanting to get out, and hopefully they're going to take away some information from today's program and be able to really enjoy what they see out and about in the flowering world.
Right.
So
great.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And
Great.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yep. Thanks for having me, Liz.